Let's take a look at a broader review of the literature on change effectiveness. A recent systematic review of research on the evidence base of organizational change in terms of critical success factors was published in the Academy of Management Annals. In a nutshell, the review identified 8 evidence-based meta-practices that should be considered when designing and implementing an organizational change effort. Here's an overview of all 8 practices. Some of these should look familiar, and as you see, they're organized in a logical sequence. We're going to take a quick look at each practice, then circle back to see how our framework compares to the evidence base in terms of the meta-practices. First, change starts with a shift in the external environment that creates an opportunity or threat to which the organization must respond in order to survive or stay competitive. So the first practice requires a thorough diagnosis of the internal and external environment and a realistic assessment of organizational capabilities to adapt to the change. Although creating a sense of urgency, where Kotter starts his steps, is important, creating urgency too early can lead to a threat rigidity response where people are paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, making change difficult. Second, for a guiding coalition to lead the change, evidence suggests that the frames of reference that leaders use and the identities they possess should match the values and beliefs of the organization. This builds credibility and trust. Third, a compelling and clear vision needs to focus on shared interests and collective goals. This builds a shared understanding of where the organization is heading. Multiple channels need to be used for communicating that vision, all aimed at motivating people to have favorable impressions of the change and to trust where management is leading them. Fourth, the AMO model, which is consistent with the theory of planned behavior that links attitudes, intentions, and actions, has been shown to mobilize energy for change. Training and development is needed to enhance people's ability to engage in the new behaviors needed to support the change. Incentives are needed to motivate those new behaviors, and opportunities are needed to encourage people to practice those new behaviors. Fifth, empowering others to support and implement the change is needed to enable people to take ownership and exercise self-determination or intrinsic motivation. The more self-determined people are in the context of the change, the more they'll be ready to accept the change. Interventions aimed at helping others become empowered are more effective when done in group versus individual settings. Sixth, developing and leveraging related knowledge, skills, and abilities overlaps with the AMO model we just referenced, in that it's about training and development, targeting the new skills that are needed for the change. Training builds self-efficacy, which fuels motivation to support the change, consistent with the idealized influence dimension of transformational leadership. Leaders need to model these skills. Pilot programs, consistent with Kotter's idea of early wins, promotes uptake of the change, enhances learning, and reduces uncertainty. Seventh, change requires resources, even when it's about cost-cutting. Failure to provide those resources undermines implementation. Metrics, monitoring, and feedback mechanisms provide guidance on where resources may be needed to be allocated or redirected, as well as how change goals may need to be modified. Finally, embedding change in the culture and management succession practices is about creating new routines and organizational habits that are embedded in the organization. This is very consistent with Kotter's 8th step of anchoring approaches in the new culture. So, how do the meta practices compare to our framework? They're quite consistent. They follow the same logical order, and the meta practices address points that were underemphasized by Kotter, namely including analysis and diagnosis up front, not emphasizing urgency too soon, and including feedback and redesign mechanisms to monitor and tweak the changes needed. Specific meta practices also line up with our implementation levers. Practices 6 and 8 are consistent with socialization. Practices 4 and 5 support committing. Practices 4 and 5 also relate to allocating rewards. And finally, practice 7 is identical to feedback and redesign. To summarize, we've seen our change model is consistent with both the evidence base of meta practices on change effectiveness as well as Kotter's 8 steps. The only caveat is Kotter's model underemphasizes analysis, diagnosis, and feedback, and overemphasizes urgency by bringing it in a bit too early in the change process. Overall, we can internalize a model of change that is supported by the evidence that involves 4 major phases: analyzing the problem or opportunity and developing a preliminary change model, building a coalition to support the change, developing and communicating a compelling vision and sense of urgency, and building change capabilities and rewarding early wins, and reinforcing the change process through institutionalization.